This lecture is on nerves and reflexes. This lecture is based on Martini's chapter 13 and 14.6. Here are the learning objectives. The drawing assignments are as follows. Draw and label a neuron, a nerve, central nervous system neurons and support cells, Schwann cells and myelination, chemical synapses, and a neuron with neuroglia and axons from many other neurons. So a neuron, nerve, central nervous system neurons and support cells, Schwann cells and myelination, chemical synapse, neuron with neuroglia and axons from many other neurons. Okay, the general organization of the nervous system. The central nervous system includes the spinal cord and the brain. 96% of the nervous tissue in the body is in the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is all neurons and all axons of neurons that are outside the central nervous system. The general organization of the nervous system is as follows. Sensory neurons send information about the environment to the spinal cord and brain. The spinal cord and brain decide on a reaction. And motor neurons send commands to muscles or other organs to react. This is the simplest explanation of the function of the nervous system, but we know in humans and in many other creatures, the nervous system is much more complex than that. For example, in humans, the brain thinks, plans, creates memories, and produces language, all outside of the basic organization of sensory and decision-making and motor out. Okay. Let's talk about nervous system cells. Neurons are the basic nerve cells that transmit electrical impulses or action potentials. And neuroglia are nervous system cells that support neurons. Neurons have a cell body, sometimes called a soma, and two types of cellular processes, dendrites and axons. The cell bodies of neurons contain the nucleus, mitochondria, and all the other organelles, things like endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparatus, vesicles, all of that stuff. The cell bodies of neurons contain many free ribosomes and a lot of rough endoplasmic reticulum where proteins are made. These organelles are found in clusters called Niesel bodies. And the reason that is important is because Niesel bodies give cell bodies a gray color when they're preserved. So areas of the nervous system that contain many cell bodies appear gray and are called gray matter. So many cell bodies, gray matter. Neurons have dendrites or cellular processes or extensions. The dendrites receive incoming electrical impulses or information from the environment or other cells. Sometimes dendrites are called sensory processes. Neurons also have an axon, a single cellular process or extension. Axons are often called nerve fibers. Again, it's a thing where early anatomists saw something long and stringy looking, and they called it a fiber. This is different than the collagen fibers that we saw, or from calling a muscle cell a muscle fiber. Now they're calling axons nerve fibers, and axons are a long structure that is part of a neuron. Many axons are more than 3 feet long. Combined with their cell bodies, this makes neurons the longest cells in the body. The area in a neuron where the axon leaves the cell body is called the axon hillock. That will come up a bit later. Axons end at telodendrion, or fine branches, and finally at axon terminals. At the axon terminal, the axon shares the electrical impulse that has been sent down an axon to another cell. Axons transmit electrical impulses from the cell body to a target, which might be another neuron or an effector organ, like a muscle or a gland. The impulse starts at the axon hillock. Neurons are usually not able to divide, sadly. They have a very limited ability to heal after an injury. Neuroglia are able to divide, and they help neurons to repair as much as possible after an injury. So this is the second really vital type of tissue that we found out cannot divide and repair itself The first one was cardiac muscle. So just sad if a person has a stroke and some of their neurons die. Neurons are not usually able to divide and replace those cells. This is similar to if a person has a heart attack and certain cardiac muscle cells die, the body is not able to produce more cardiac muscle cells, and the function of the heart is then impaired. Okay, so nerve structure. So axons or nerve fibers are bundled together into fascicles, and then the fascicles are bundled into nerves. A nerve is a bundle of fascicles. However, often people will kind of interchangeably say that a nerve is a bundle of axons. Okay, and they'll kind of skip the part that all of the axons are bundled into fascicles and the fascicles are bundled into the nerves. But, you get the idea. So going from small to large, axons in the peripheral nervous system, not in the central nervous system, are surrounded by a connective tissue endoneurium, a kind of wrapping around the cell and also around protective Schwann cells that are around the axons, which we'll discuss later. Fascicles are surrounded by a connective tissue perineurium, and nerves are surrounded by a connective tissue epineurium. And here's a picture in which the endoneurium is not visible, but you can easily see the blue perineurium around this fascicle, and then more blue epineurium around the whole nerve. Ganglia refers to several ganglion, and a ganglion is a cluster of neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So this isn't axons, this is a clump of the cell bodies found together in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, neuron structure. Neurons may have 4 different structures based on the location of the cell body and the number of processes on the cell. There are multipolar, pseudo-unipolar, bipolar, and anaxonic neurons. Multipolar neurons have multiple dendrites, the cell body, and then one axon. Multipolar neurons are the most common type of neuron in the central nervous system. Motor neurons are multipolar neurons. Pseudo-unipolar neurons have dendrites that are connected to an axon. The axon passes by the cell body, which is off to one side. Pseudo-unipolar neurons are the type of neuron that most sensory neurons are. Bipolar neurons have dendrites, a cell body, then an axon. Some sensory neurons that carry information about smell, sight, and sound are bipolar neurons. Anaxonic neurons are small. They have dendrites and axons that are difficult to tell apart. Some special sense organs contain anaxonic neurons. Otherwise, anaxonic neurons are only found in the central nervous system, and actually the function of anaxonic neurons are poorly understood. The 2 main types of neuron structures to learn are the multipolar neurons and the pseudo-unipolar neurons. And just to remind you, the multipolar neurons are motor neurons. I mean, not exclusively. Motor neurons are multipolar neurons, and sensory neurons are usually pseudo-unipolar neurons. So remember that for later, it will come up again. Okay, so neuron functions. Neurons are classified into 3 groups based on their function. There are sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons. Sensory information enters the central nervous system through 2 types of sensory neurons: visceral sensory neurons and somatic sensory neurons. It passes through interneurons to visceral or somatic motor neurons that send commands to visceral effectors or skeletal muscles, respectively. And looking at this chart helps a lot. It starts in the left upper corner, goes across the top of this little picture here, and then it goes down, and then it travels left. So it kind of goes in a little horseshoe shape here, and you can just work your way through it and see what's going on. Sensory neurons send information from the outer environment or from the inside of the body to the spinal cord and brain. Sensory neurons send this information via axons that are also called afferent fibers. Afferent means incoming. And let me just put that afferent for incoming. Okay, then sensory receptors are dendrites or specialized cells that respond to specific stimuli in the environment. Stimulation of a sensory receptor sends an impulse to a sensory neuron. And I put on the side here the tactile receptors in skin that we saw when we were learning skin as examples of different kinds of sensory receptors. We had some sensory receptors that had dendrites leading to sensory neurons, and then we had some specialized cells, for example, our Merkel cells that we found in the epithelium that were close to tactile discs, which then led to axons, which led to sensory neuron cell bodies, etc. So this is just to remind us that we've already seen this. Now, a little bit about the classification of sensory receptors. There are two systems of classification that mostly, but not completely, overlap. Martini's uses both in their illustrations. So let's go over them. The first and more common system is somatic sensory receptors that monitor the skin, joints, and skeletal muscles for pain, touch, pressure, temperature, and position sense. Visceral sensory receptors that monitor the cardiovascular, respiratory, digestive, urinary, and reproductive systems. And then special sensory receptors that sense smell, vision, hearing, taste, and balance. And here's a big picture from Martini's. And in the left lower corner, we see our receptors, the somatic sensory, the visceral sensory, and the special sensory receptors. The second system of receptors is less commonly used. It includes exteroceptors that sense external touch, pressure, temperature, smell, vision, and hearing. Proprioceptors that sense body position and movement. And then interoceptors that monitor the cardiovascular, respiratory, digestive, urinary, and reproductive systems for pain, deep pressure, and taste, which is separated out from the other senses. And here's a picture showing how Martini's used that classification of receptors, interoceptors, exteroceptors, and proprioceptors in this picture. The systems do not correlate exactly. Somatic sensory receptors may be exteroceptors, proprioceptors, or interoceptors. Visceral sensory receptors are equal to interoceptors. Special sensory receptors may be exteroceptors, proprioceptors, or interoceptors. So there is not a perfect correlation by any means. The first system is used more often clinically. However, the classification of proprioceptors, receptors that sense body position and movement, is also often used. Okay, interneurons and motor neurons. Interneurons are found in the spinal cord and brain. They are located between sensory neurons and motor neurons. They receive and integrate sensory input and coordinate and initiate motor output. Some interneurons are excitatory and others are inhibitory. And if we look at this picture here, we see sensory receptors and then sensory neurons coming in from the environment or from parts of the body to the central nervous system, that is the spine and the brain. And then we see our interneurons on the far right of this picture, and then they're going to go out to the motor neurons on the bottom. Motor neurons have cell bodies within the brain and spinal cord. There are two types of motor neurons, somatic motor neurons and visceral motor neurons. They send commands from the central nervous system to effector cells through efferent or outgoing fibers. So the afferent fibers are incoming and efferent fibers are outgoing. So just remember, it's just the difference of an A or an E, okay? I try to remember that E is for exit or outgoing. The commands travel through two different motor nervous systems, the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. And in this picture from Martini's, you follow in the sensory input to the central nervous system at the top, and then On the right side of the picture, we see motor commands coming out, and the commands travel through the two different nervous systems, the somatic motor nervous system and the autonomic motor nervous system. Somatic motor neurons send commands through the somatic nervous system to skeletal muscle. Visceral motor neurons send commands through the autonomic nervous system to cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, glands, and adipose tissue. And here's just that picture we've been working on, describing what I just went over. You can have a look at that. Okay, so a bit more on the somatic and autonomic nervous system. So somatic motor neuron axons travel to neuromuscular junctions where they synapse with skeletal muscle fibers. The somatic nervous system carries voluntary and involuntary commands. Involuntary commands maintain muscle tone and perform reflex reactions. The autonomic nervous system has three divisions: the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, and the enteric nervous system, or the neurons in the digestive system. The autonomic nervous system carries involuntary impulses. The sympathetic nervous system usually causes excitation of the target tissue, which is often called a fight or flight reaction. The parasympathetic nervous system usually causes inhibition of the target tissue, a rest and digest reaction. And here's our picture just again, showing somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So